Welcome to Unabridged Bookstore and another virtual event. Tonight we are thrilled to have Dr. Stacee Reicherzer to talk about the Healing Otherness Handbook. We're very excited about having this book here and very excited that Dr. Stacee has agreed to join us to have this talk. And we're also excited tonight to have John F. Marszalek, the author of Coming Out of the Magnolia Closet, a friend of Dr. Stacee who's going to lead us in a conversation tonight. We're thrilled to have both of you with us, and thank you for joining us to have this conversation. For those of you that are attending tonight, if you have a question throughout the evening, toward the bottom of your screen, you should see a little panel that says Q&A. That function is open for you to drop a question throughout. And as we have time and as the conversation allows, we will get to your questions there. Like I said, if you're having some technical difficulties or have questions about Unabridged Bookstore or any of the other events or book clubs that we host, instead of putting those in the Q&A there, you can just respond to the email that you were sent earlier, and I'll get back to you with information about those. But for now, I'm also going to drop in the chat here that you should have on the side of your screen a link to our website. If you haven't had a chance to check out either of these books yet or know somebody that might be interested, you can click there to order. We've got them available for pickup here in the store, and we're also happy to send them to you wherever you are. So thank you for joining us, and help me welcome Dr. Stacee and John to our conversation here.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. We're so very glad that y'all are here, and I'm very, very excited to be joined by my friend and my colleague, Dr. John Marszalek. When I was asked to, have a conversation, who would I have a conversation with about my book? Of course, the first person that came to me was John, because of his great research that he's done for his book, Coming Out of the Magnolia Closet. Itself just a real story. And a powerful one at that, of same-sex couples in Mississippi. And it meant everything to me that he would be the person who's really guiding me through this conversation, through my own thought process about my book tonight, and that we could really touch on some shared experiences that are part of our world, and what they've been and how they guided our writing. So John, I'm just going to turn it right over to you then and let you guide us on in here.
I will do that. And I want to say that I appreciate you asking me, because when I was writing my book, you were so supportive of me. I remember many conversations on the phone talking about the process and asking for your advice. So we've had a great friendship and collaboration over the years.
Sure have.
So let's see. Well, I guess we should say, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask us any questions, and we'll start talking. And as questions come up, we'll also jump in and answer your questions. But the question I always like to ask, because I think it's so interesting, and you and I, of course, have talked about this, about both our books, but how did you decide to write this book in the first place?
It's a great question. And the work for me with understanding otherness really began many years ago. I was doing couples work with a male couple down in Austin, Texas. And, I was consulting with a colleague, because it was a couple with couples issues. They bring in what couples always bring in. What do you want to work on? Communication. That's what couples always say in couples therapy.
More money.
So it's everybody's story. And so we were doing all of this great work, and then reached this roadblock, and I didn't quite have a way to conceptualize it. And I was talking with a colleague about it, and he said, what if you were to really target the trauma memory that each of these men had of learning what it means to be gay, what it means for him to be gay? Now, and to contextualize this, these were men who had been teenagers in the 1990s, one from East Texas, one from Arkansas. So each of them had very traumatic experiences of gay identity development, both developing of course, the sexually and having no one to talk about it with, but also the identity piece about it, and just all of the interrogation that went with that within, and then the external experiences, one of whom was really silenced and came to really almost swallow his pain. He really did this thing where he would just carry a pit in his stomach, and there was a lot of this experience of swallowing pain. The other of whom had a really violent experience in his identity development. So, you know, when I began doing this work, it began just doing this trauma work with these men and really engaging them in this experience and working to have something transformative where they could somehow, in spite of these experiences, move forward in their lives, move forward in their coupleship, be able to do things in a healthier way. And so from doing that, and then starting a conversation with another colleague who had a similar experience with her son, and she said, you know, I've been worried about him ever since this thing where he got in the car one day and said to me, "Mom, am I black trash?" And he was, you know, he was in 5th grade, and this is an African American family, and so she was really interrogating. Well, what was, you know, how was this message going to impact him? How was this first time he knew what it means to be other? In this case, as a black boy in America. And then I started thinking, well, is there a parallel to what these experiences are? Is there something that touches? Obviously, racism is a very is America's original sin, and it's a very, very different experience. But the experiences that each of us have are deeply painful, and they set us forth on a trajectory that we then spend a lot of time working to heal. And so as I began engaging this work and having conversations and doing trainings, I started to hear so many more experiences of otherness, of people who had been treated this way because of their gender identity development, because of, or just their gender, because they were girls in a very misogynistic culture, or experiences, very early experiences with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, experiences with body size. Body shaming was a huge otherness story. Neurodiversity, people who had, as kids, had ADHD or have ADHD, you know, and had been just horribly mistreated in their school because of how they just, you know, were, and their inability to sit still, which of course they couldn't sit still. They have ADHD, you know, and all of these experiences, they just really coalesced around it. And my mentor at the time said to me, if I was Stacee, I would write a book. And finally I realized what a right thing this was. And this was the story that I wanted to tell. And I wanted it to be something to guide people through healing these experiences of otherness.
And that's one of the things that amazed me as I read your book, is how you connected all these different groups, that this whole concept of otherness is something that so many of us relate to. And you don't really stop and think how many people it applies to until you sit down and, you know, read something like your book.
Well, you know, and that's the thing that I find to be just continually disturbing, I should say, because it's really disturbing how common this is, you know, and how, even though these are vastly different experiences that we're talking about, there's also the reality of I'm getting a little bit of feedback on a mic. Is that your mic? Maybe it is. Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna speak. Oh, I'm not getting the echo. You. And so I don't know who it is. Maybe it's not you. But back to my story. So you know, the experience that I had, though, and have continued to have, is that this is so real. And these are experiences that are real in so many different kinds of ways. People have this stuff, and it just it really diminishes so many parts of them along the way. And that's the part that I learned. And I would see it, of course, because not only in my therapy work, but I think about just working in the business world and seeing people who had clearly arisen from these real experiences of marginalization in their backgrounds, and they were now working twice as hard to try and prove themselves. They worked hard to demonstrate a continuous facade, is what it was, of confidence, of assuredness in what they were doing. And I think that it's a really important thing to see and to recognize. You know, because people are doing those kinds of things out of a sense of fear. It's a fear that if I don't do that, then I'm going to be left out, that I'm going to lose out, that I'm going to lose this job. It's just a sense of tenuousness, and it can be, it can come from a lot of places, because it can come from a place of reality, in the fact that we know people have had to work twice as hard in some instances because of the fact that there were so many odds stacked against them, and because the expectation in society, in the business world, was that in fact they were going to fail. So that's a lot to live with, and what it does, even when people move into sometimes safer spaces in their lives, they don't just put that stuff down and put it away. It stays with them, and they stay with these sort of rigid ways of doing and being that are in fact very, very damaging. Because if you think about working twice as hard, I say this a lot, and I use this as an analogy in the book. If you and I go out and buy a new car today, not like we can, because new cars are suddenly very scarce, and so if we both bought a used car, that had 50,000 miles on it, but if we both bought a car today, and you drove yours twice as hard and twice as fast as I do, well, in 5 years, your car is going to be in significantly worse shape than mine. And that's just true of human beings. We take a toll on our bodies, we take a toll on our emotional health, on our spirit, and that's the reality that goes along with this.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me as I read your book and in what you're saying now is that, as you know, when I was interviewing the couples for my book about their experiences, the same-sex couples in this really, really conservative state, they talked about this fear of being themselves, that they had felt this pressure to not be too gay, to not be too queer, to not be too different from whatever their gender identity is, or to not express their gender identity. And so it was this constant pressure that if I present myself as who I am, if I'm too queer, then I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be thrown out of my family. I'm not going to be accepted by people in my community. I may even get hurt. And that whole fear piece that I talk to my participants about really comes through in your book, and applying it to just all sorts of different people. So I wondered if you could talk about that fear piece.
Yeah, and I talk about this as a rule of fear, as you'd better tone it down, which is that sort of learned experience. It's that social compact and you describe it really beautifully, that people make, essentially saying, it's oftentimes just a completely internal process that they're making in a supposed negotiation with this external set of systemic forces that are going on for them. So what's happening is that the individual says, okay, if I tone down these parts of myself, then I'll be approvable. If I work hard to assimilate and to pass as my oppressor, then perhaps I won't be oppressed. And so when we talk about this with queer people, that's same-sex people, people in same-sex relationships, that's queer people in general trying to pass as heterosexual. And trans people, I think about this, and I thought about my own experiences, and what went on for me was I transitioned when I was 19. That's when I started hormones and began transitioning my body. Well, in Texas, in San Antonio, where I was growing up, there were two ways of, there were two genders, female or male. There were transsexual women. Certainly, I knew them, but that was in an underground bar culture, and it wasn't anything that I think there was room for in the space I existed in. So the necessity was to try and pass as cisgender. And I'll tell you this, when I was getting in preparation for my gender affirmation surgery, which at the time we just called sexual reassignment surgery because it was a much, it was a much less kind time. The dominant psychiatric thought, and the psychiatrist to whom I spoke, were the coaching they gave was that I needed to now think of myself as a woman. I don't need to think of myself as a trans woman. I need to think of myself as a woman, and to invent a past about myself so that when people would ask, well, and did you play basketball? Oh my gosh, yes, and so, and just make up a story about girls basketball and all of these other kinds of things. So it essentially and this was psychiatry. This was the early 90s. This wasn't a very long time ago. This was the Clinton years, so not even the George H. This was, well, no, it was George H. still. But I digress. To think about that, we realize that sometimes we're in these situations, we're existing in these places of having to put aside, to sublimate ourselves in order to exist in space and time, and just to be able to stay safe. And in this case, what psychiatry was doing was really reasserting the transphobic world I lived in, the heteronormative world, the gender binary world, that said there's no room for you as you are. So instead, we need to go ahead and create a new way of you to think about and name yourself. And so everything that was trans about me, I believed I needed to tone down in order to exist. And I think a lot of people tone down a lot of things about themselves in order to exist in their professional world and their social world. We make those decisions all the time, because as queer people, we have to think about safety when we go out into the world. Right now there are, because of the rise of anti-Semitism, there are Jews who aren't wearing kippas and things like that, because they're having to make their Jewish identity less visible in order to stay safe. And so we can recognize how these things have really permeated into culture, and how the rules of assimilation keep showing up in our lives. So it's a really very, very damaging thing to live in such a highly scripted way, and being both hyper visible and yet invisible.
Yeah, it becomes a reflex, really, for somebody. Yeah. Stacee, there's a question for you in here. Let me read it to you and for the listeners. This is from Bill Fan. Hi, Stacee. Do you have a suggestion on how to approach all the great exercises in your book? I read the book once and I want to reread it, this time focusing on the exercises. Do I start from beginning to end, or pick the ones that best fit for my needs?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I appreciate the question. I think that you can cherry pick. The book itself is not necessarily written in a stepwise manner. I think as I was developing it, the earlier activities, the earlier rules of fear were the things that seemed almost more accessible, something that perhaps were a bit gentler for people to recognize, and that moved progressively into things that were a bit more difficult. So people could look at something like inauthenticity, for example, a lot more easily than looking into hopelessness and just and resentment, for instance, and how these have played out. So, if you've read the book now, and you're going to move through it, I think that you can move along and get into the exercises just as they seem to speak to you. So I sometimes myself, because I also use the exercises in the book, so I'll sometimes go ahead and just take a look and see sort of what's speaking to me today as something, because there are times when it may be that you're finding yourself engaged in a process, for instance, of working twice as hard. And that's really where you're needing to do the activity, or alternatively, where you're really trying to get to the root of resentment and this notion, however, that you shouldn't feel resentful about something that you feel legitimate resentment toward. So these are really important things, and I don't think that there needs to be a hard and fast rule. I think that you get to do it in a way that is clear and makes sense for you. And one nice thing is that if you do a series of exercises, you can then look back and say, okay, well, is there something that I'm next needing to do, and that might maybe complement this because it brought up this other part of me. So, and I think it can be something that you use just whenever, like a good cookbook that has those fabulous recipes in there that you enjoy and want to go back to. So I really appreciate the question.
Well, it strikes me, and my mute's off. It strikes me, Stacey, that you have some of those great exercises on journaling. And I can imagine for myself or for anybody, as you're going through some of these journaling exercises, that different things may come up within yourself. And then you say, similar to what you're saying, I think I want to go revisit this other activity that really spoke to maybe the fear that's coming up inside me or some anger that's coming up inside me. And then it may be this constant revisiting of things as you continue to grow as a person and really look at this, as you call it, the internalized oppressor inside.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think it's, the thing that's true is that the exercises in the book can, I think, mean different things at different times for us too. Because what's true about this is that we start engaging a process just where we are today. But what's often the case, and I think you all understand this, is that what you're sitting with today, the things that feel immediate and feel like the greatest stressors, can look really different in a short time. And just to test this out, what was the most stressful thing going on for you? Well, we won't say last year because I'm guessing it was COVID. It was COVID, and then Memorial Day weekend happened. Of course, there were the murder of George Floyd. There was a lot that happened. So so those are worldwide events. Let's say this: what was the most stressful thing going on for you 2 years ago today? And if I was to ask you that, well, probably everybody here, unless you had a particular incident, would think, well, what was I stressed out about? What were the stressors of the day? What was I struggling with? What was, where was I feeling demoralized? Where was I feeling just diminished? What were the parts of me that were most exhausted? How did that exhaustion show up? What were those experiences? So, and what you needed and how you might have done exercises then would look very different from how you might deal with something today. And certainly with what you might uncover later on, because one thing about doing this stuff is that we continue to circle into and deeper to the center of things. It's rather like a labyrinth, and we're just moving continuously in, and then we hit this barrier, and we curve in and go a little bit more like that. Sometimes we just stay at the barrier for a little bit. But I think each time we become a little bit better at it, because the one thing that's true is that once you've done work like this, you might sometimes forget it. You might forget the lessons you learned in the moment, but you won't ever unlearn it. You won't ever unlearn the lessons that you've learned. When you've been exposed to a new way of seeing yourself, when you've done a little bit of healing work, you aren't going to unheal that. You might sometimes forget those lessons, but that forgetting part is temporary. It's something that I maintain that people have always the capacity to revisit good, healthy work, the things that have really transformed them and made them change and help them grow in a really new and energizing way.
That makes a lot of sense. I remember the story. This is not from a book, but a story a psychologist told me one time. He was a friend of mine, and said, "This is an older, wise man. He'd been a psychologist for years, a gay man. He'd done all this work to really deal with his own internalized homophobia, which is hard not to have, especially at his age, because he grew up in a time when it was even illegal to have sex with another man, or have sex. You know what I mean?" So he said that he felt like he was very integrated in his identity. He felt really good about himself. And one day he was at some friend's house and they're having a party. And there's a knock at the door and there's a policeman there. And this was like a pool party. And the policeman said, "I've got a complaint from a neighbor about you being too loud." And he said in that moment, he caught himself toning down his gayness, as he put it, because he had this fear just build up inside him. And it made me think, in terms of your book, you talk about the whole part about being sassy, to fight back against this eternal oppressor. And how do we balance, as people who are othered, how do we balance that sassiness versus when it's realistic to protect ourselves by hiding? It's such a difficult question,
It is a difficult question, and I think there's so many layers to this, because, and when I was once doing some great research when I was first encountering the term rejection sensitivity. It was actually, the piece had interviewed gay and bisexual men in order to come to the conclusions. The authors had done a survey, and at its essence, what they had done was that they had presented these men with a variety of scenarios of being of being given a ticket if they got pulled over, of being of all these various things that were really that would present hardships in their lives, that these were disciplinary measures at work. It was a lot of different kinds of things, and how often these men would perceive that this experience that would be more negative because of their sexual identity. And so there was an expectation. What the conclusion was that there was an expectation amongst gay men, among the men in this study, specifically gay and bisexual men, that there would be a higher incidence of social rejection, of very real social opprobrium as a result of these when they have these encounters. So the thing that's true though is, and I think about your friend, he might have been in more danger. There might have been, because it has to be thinking about always the reality of it. And is this going to be a safe interaction? Well, what we know very real. What's very true is that police are not always safe. Police have there are ongoing incidents where police have demonstrated a lot of very, very problematic behaviors, certainly with Black men. But what we don't even see necessarily documented is how many instances people historically with visibly queer people hold of incidents with police. There we go. Sometimes I do that. That's just one of my little linguistic devices. So, so back to the question of SAS and what SAS's role is, and I really like what this represents, because SAS for me, it's one of those cool things because at first blush we think of it as talking back, and in truth it really does come from that. It is the affirmation of self. It is the statement of self in an experience. In the book, I spoke about Sassy St. James, who is a transsexual friend of mine back in San Antonio. She was a showgirl who was about 10 years older than I, and who had an extraordinary experience of marginalization as a gay boy first, who was gender nonconforming, also Mexican American, also living in a housing project in a working poor family. There were a lot of strikes against her from birth, and then as she was moving into her identity, those things became harder. But when she chose her stage name, she chose Sassy because she was really talking back to the world, and she was talking back to homophobia. She was talking back to transphobia, and she was talking back to all those systemic forces that told her she couldn't be who she needed to be in the world and the space that she needed to take up. So I view SAS as very much that articulation that oftentimes begins with boundary setting and saying, whoa, I have a right to be. I'm okay with representing myself. But also, I think SAS, though, becomes a very useful tool for talking down our internal oppressor, those negative beliefs that we hold about ourselves that are limiting, that we somehow must diminish ourselves diminish in order to exist in the world. So in the example of your friend, he toned down his gayness in order to, or what he whatever that meant for him. He was, I think we understand what that means, but what that means is that he was somehow sublimating and somehow hiding and obfuscating the things that were visible, that he would be more naturally inclined to do. His method of interaction, his method of speaking probably, and how he held himself and things like that, so as not to create an unsafe situation for him. So I think the place where SAS might exist for him is to be able to somehow talk back to whatever negative messages existed for him thereafter, and for him to really use sass as an interrogation tool to say, well, why did I really need to do that? And what did it mean? And how do I now use sass to perhaps transform the world in just some small way to where maybe next time I shouldn't expect to have to do that?
Yeah, I was thinking, and this is going to tie into another question that came in. I was thinking about, now my mind went blank, which is hilarious. So I will just go to the question. Whatever I was going to say will come back to me. So somebody wants to know, oh, I know what it was. It was this notion that I talk about in my book about the notion of queer spaces. That queer spaces are when queer people come together and they can be away from the outside world that can put so much pressure on you, and you can just let down your guard and you can be yourself. And it can give you some strength when you go into the larger community, where you may need to really talk back against the exterior world, but also that internal oppressor. But then one of the attendees says that, I'll say they, because I'm not sure who it is. So they see so much prejudice and discrimination within our own queer community. And they say, I can only describe it as feeling otherness within the otherness of being LGBTQ+. Race, gender, identity, socioeconomics, body type, country of origin, and much more. You would think our community would be united by the challenges and obstacles we grow up with, but it always doesn't turn out that way. Any advice for those of us who are others within the otherness of the LGBTQ+ community?
Yeah, thank you for the question. You know, and I was actually just having a great conversation yesterday with my rabbi about this very thing, about when oppressed people themselves become the oppressor. And it's a important thing to recognize that when marginalized people somehow have these experiences of now finding their tribe, finding our tribe, whatever tribe it is, and finding our way home and being around others like us, and being able to now start articulating that and being able to say, okay, we are all shared in this experience. We have this thing about us. And I think this is very true for queer people. Simply being able to do that, it doesn't mean that they're now truly healthy people, that they're now inclusive people. Any more than a person becoming sober who has an alcohol or drug addiction has suddenly also healed their anxiety or schizophrenia or depression. And I realize these are aren't parallel concepts, but if you can follow the logic here, what I do see happening is that people will, in many instances, they'll come out, they'll find their space, and they'll exist within that space, but they haven't yet ever done the hard work of examining, for example, racism, as was described, or just the experiences of fat phobia and body shaming. They haven't yet gotten past sometimes very real misogyny, and which is a very a truth that we see within the LGBT community. Transphobia, they see what they've gotten to when they look at their own world, and they have that, but they didn't necessarily yet get the exposure. So the question is what to do about that, what to be about a person who's marginalized within the marginalized community. And my experience tells me that the need for this is to first recognize that these are people who, even though they've overcome this one thing, have still many parts of themselves that are still very, very much hurting and very much broken, and that there is a lot more work that sometimes has to be done to find our own tribe within the tribe. And the challenge is that when we see these instances, we tend to personalize them, and it tends to recreate our own otherness trauma, re-trigger it, and we start to really feel demoralized in these experiences. But when we can step back from it and realize this that I'm experiencing isn't so much about something that I did or am doing wrong. It's simply that I'm not around my people yet. I'm around people who share a part of identity, but that doesn't make them any more my people any more than everybody from San Antonio, Texas, by virtue of being from San Antonio, is my people. We're all from the same geographic region, but that doesn't make them my people. It's not, and I think that's a truth, to be able to recognize sometimes we have to do a little bit more work to find our tribe, and to recognize that that there are people out there who are looking for the same level of acceptance, who are looking to accept and embrace and include those who are just who are like them, or sometimes very much unlike them, because that's within them. And I think that's an important piece, because just as you encounter this, we also see a lot of great work that's being done. Here in Chicago, we have, for instance, the Chicago Black Drag Council. You wouldn't know about this, John, but that was an effort that came about last year in response to the George Floyd's murder, and the protests, the civil unrest. And so it was to talk about the inequities within the community, and how drag queens of color, specifically Black drag queens, were being left out. And so, it was really an important thing, and led to a lot of important conversations and actions to right these situations that were happening. So I think that we have to engage ourselves first of all, and look at this as a process, but also then be able to find the community, people who, like us, are doing that deep level of engagement, and who are looking for somebody just like us to be able to include, and trusting that those folks exist out there. What do you think about that, John?
Yeah, I was processing what you said, because I really like what you were saying. I was thinking about, I guess, kind of related but different, and I was thinking about some of the couples I interviewed who said that, similar to what the questioner said, was that, in particular, I remember this Black male couple that talked about that you wouldn't think there'd be prejudice within the gay community, within the LGBTQ plus community, but that there is. And the prejudice that has been in Mississippi for years and still there is still seeps into these other communities sometimes. And they talk about having to find their communities within this other community, which is really sad. But I guess, there are jerks everywhere. And I think that was something was eye-opening for me when I was younger, was when I realized that just because I'm with a group of other gay men or other LGBTQ plus people, it doesn't mean that I'm going to like them all or get along with them all, that there's still going to be jerks within that community, And it was big, for some reason, it was a huge eye-opening realization for me back then.
Yeah, but sometimes I think, and also a truth is that people who have been extremely hurt and extremely othered themselves will become the oppressor.
That's right.
They will themselves sometimes be very cruel people themselves. And I think that's just, there's a lot of unexamined trauma in people's lives. And so I don't think that's just a universal truth, and that's, people are just, are aggressive toward one another because of this place of deep hurt. I think what happens is people find their small place, and they don't interrogate themselves any further from there. They don't interrogate whether or not they're being inclusive, or looking around and saying, what's still going on for me. But we can recognize, though, that, for instance, to become anti-racist requires it's a great deal of work, and it requires a concerted commitment from each non-BIPOC person, each person from the dominant culture, to do this. It requires white people to do a lot of work, in short, and to be able to reach out and say, what's blocking my inclusivity, what's blocking me from creating a space of inclusivity, and what is that about? So these are important challenges that we're talking about. And I actually did a case in here of a person who was coming out and their experience, and just how that impacted them, and that was in chapter 8, I believe. So it's certainly a situation that I'm very familiar with, and unfortunately, because of how real this is within the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, it reminds me, if we talk about in counseling and psychology, how oftentimes a narcissist is somebody who has it deep inside, has a very, very low self-esteem. And, so one of the things that you talk about in your book also is, we were talking about the whole notion of the internal oppressor. And you were talking, when you first started tonight, you were talking about the couple that you worked with, a long, long time ago. And I remember one of the things that sometimes comes up with couples that I interviewed, or any couples I've worked with, is that one member of the relationship will be more out than the other, or one may have moved further along in their ability to be sassy to the internal oppressor. And I just wondered, I don't know if you have any advice for any listeners that wonder, how do you do that when you're friends with somebody who's in a different place than you are, or you're in a relationship with somebody who's in a different place that you are?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, in those instances where you've got one who is has done maybe just a bit more work with themselves, and whatever that looks like, because they've spent more time, in self-examination, they've spent more time in therapy, or they just are all around have somehow accessed a lot more that is healing, and maybe they also began in a very different place. There's we can think about people who couple, sometimes one of whom comes from a very accepting family that was, or even one that was sort of more or less, no, don't ask, don't tell, as the case may be, and being partnered with somebody else who came from a very shame-based system, or who was, maybe who had to really overcome a great deal because, they were in a heterosexual marriage and following the the divorce, and if there were children, it was just sometimes a very, very traumatic history that's part of their stuff. So each person in a couple has their own history, and the thing I think is really important is for couples to learn to be able to listen to each other's history, and to be able to really communicate what those historical parts of self are, what's fed it and what's maintaining it, but also what that's meant in their experiences. And I think if you really have love and you really have empathy, then you're going to be able to sit in your partner's experience for a moment and say, I may have no idea of what it is to have gone through something like this. I don't know. I don't know what that is, because it's just so vastly different. But I can pick up because I love this person, I'm going to make the effort to really consider what it must have been like to have been them in this situation, to have been growing up in this type of household, knowing what I know now about their family, their history, their school context, their culture, living in this, and trying to navigate and make sense of the world as it existed for them, and then the decisions that they made based on what they had at the time. And I think if we can do that, if we can learn to do that, really, it's a very, very good human practice. It helps us just in a variety of relationships, but wouldn't the place to begin this, though, be in the relationship that we consider primary for our lives?
Yeah, empathy and listening can go a long way in our society, especially in today's world. So, wow. What would you say is this is a hard question. So, what are you hoping that people will take from your book?
The thing I want people to walk away with this is just a little bit more acceptance, a little bit more understanding of their own otherness, and how it showed up for them, what those experiences were, and how those experiences shaped them. But I want them to walk away with a very different understanding of themselves, where they can be able to do this really hard task of forgiving themselves for the hard stuff that they've done, the hard decisions. I think one of the things that happens that I think really compounds otherness, it's not just the oppression, the bullying that we go through, it is the even deeper experience that happens as we move along and we look back in our later lives and feel shame about decisions we did, that we were in a more diminished place. We feel, we just feel so disgusted with ourselves about things that we do. So I think it's not enough simply to begin healing something like the tendency to believe we must tone down ourselves in order to exist in the world. It's not enough to recognize, I don't have to work twice as hard anymore to prove myself in my work or relationships. It is, but to do that is one level. The next level, though, is to be able to hold ourselves in compassion and see ourselves in those really, really difficult moments where we did things that, even though we've now held shame for, up to this point have been ashamed of, that we can look at that and have compassion for it and say, this younger me was just doing the best they could. They were really working against the odds. They were between a rock and a hard place, and they had the resources they had the life, the experience they had, the mental experience they had. They only had the energy they had at that time, and they made this decision. And to be able to do that and be able to say, I don't, that I just accept it. It just is what it is, because I'm not going to carry the burden of feeling ashamed anymore about my past. I'm not going to carry the burden of just feeling stung every time I remember a humiliating memory. I'm just not going to do that to myself anymore. I'm not going to oppress myself with my own memories anymore. I'm not going to use me against me anymore. And that's, I think, a very, very important thing. And I think if people can learn to do that and become stronger and better at it, and to continually just sit when they catch themselves doing that kind of stuff, say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to fall into this thought loop. I'm not going to start heaping coals on myself again. I'm going to back up. I'm going to see what this is about, what's going on for me. And I'm going to do a little bit of self-reflection, some work here, because that's just not what's going to be. And I want people to be sassier. I want people to be bolder. I want people to live more authentically and fully themselves, whatever that means for their capacity, because it's not, and this isn't just building people toward, all being, artistic, creative. And if that's who they are, that's wonderful. But I think it's about being your biggest self. And in doing so, I think that you become a much healthier version of you that attracts, to the earlier question, that attracts more like attracts like. And I think as we become healthier, as we start shedding this stuff, if we can start doing this work, then we're going to find other people who are doing the same work. And wow, does that become powerful. We start bringing in more people who are doing the kinds of things that we're doing, and it starts having a really big impact. And we start having a lot more compassion even for those who haven't done the work that we've done.
I think that's a really great point, because it makes me think about how people who have had to repress parts of themselves because of the fear and because of the internal oppressor, when they meet other people, those people never get the chance to see who the real person is. And so they're getting to know them based on this mask that they have on, or this other person. And then when somebody does the work that you describe in your book, it gives them the opportunity to be authentic, so that when they're with people who they want to get to know, the people that are also authentic, there's a possibility of a deeper friendship, relationship.
And I think that's so key. And I would hope that anybody who's really wanting to, do this kind of growth with somebody else might consider doing the exercises with another individual. There's book club questions too at the back as well that are great for, just a small group of trusting individuals. But, the hardest thing to do in relationships is vulnerability. And again, it comes from experiences of otherness. And part of being othered means learning how to not appear vulnerable, to not appear in any way weak. And so what we do is we move through life trying to really demonstrate, just act unbothered. I know that. I know what it is to try and act unbothered. I've been queer my entire, I've always been queer. So I know what it is to try and have to pretend that I'm not being really, really hurt by this experience I'm having when I go into public. And this is much fewer, not so frequent in my life these days, of course, but there have been times when it has been, and it can be again. And there's the experience of needing of going into a space as a visibly queer person and having to, and dealing with something that is really, that is homonegative, that is, phobic in some way, and how to still maintain dignity and to try and appear unbothered. But the challenge with it is to try and do that. It takes so much more strength. It's almost like if you were to suddenly lift up and carry now a 20-pound bag of potatoes on your back that you hadn't been planning to carry. Suddenly now you got to carry this the entire time you're at this restaurant or at this experience or whatever it is. Well, if you have to spend a lot of time doing that, that's just going to wear you down. But it also it does build a lot, but sometimes it's knowing when can you shed this? When can you when can you put this down? When can you lay down your burdens and be real once again, when you've had so many times of being where appearing unbothered was what you had to do to keep yourself safe in the moment.
I think that's really important. And a piece you talk about is being able to acknowledge all the times that someone who's been othered, any of us have been hurt, have experienced microaggressions, have experienced any of these different things. Because like you said, it's like carrying a weight on your back. And sometimes you don't even know it's there until you start doing this work and realizing that you have to, that it's there and you need to do something about it.
Yeah, sometimes the pain of carrying something is what brings you to this place, and I think that's but we've all had so many places in our lives where we've done this, and the challenge is that when you're so accustomed to carrying so much weight, when you're so accustomed to having to exist and pretend to be unbothered just in order to safely navigate the world, you don't always recognize safety. You don't always recognize the places that you don't have to do this. And so it just becomes a much more reflexive response. Just like your friend that you're talking about, his reflexive safety response was to suddenly do whatever appearing straight meant to him. And that is a survival mechanism that every queer person learns. Because we have to learn it, and that's a learned behavior. And so, but that's a kind of thing though that just is so draining from this form of trauma. It's a form of traumatic grief that is coupled with exhaustion, and that is what it means to be other and to have carried this stuff in society.
I think you make such wonderful points. And for those of you who haven't read Dr. Stacee's book yet, I hope that you will pick it up in the bookstore, and it'll really change your life, I think. We have just a few more minutes. I don't know if any of our attendees have any questions before we wrap up.
If not, well, then I'll also do a plug for Dr. John Marszalek's book, Coming Out of the Magnolia Closet, which is fantastic. A wonderful study with same-sex couples in Mississippi and their challenges, how they forge identity, and also just some really surprising, exciting things about how people really how they flourished in spite of the odds. And I love that. I love seeing things because it just what resilient people these are, and how they do their thing, even in instances that don't seem like they've been very nourishing for their lives. So it makes me very, very happy. So it is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it for everybody.
Thank you, Stacee. And I learned that all of us queer Mississippians have some sass in us. I didn't realize we had until I read your book.
Thank you so much. Hi, Matt.
Hi, I'm popping in to say as a former Mississippian that I think that's very
right.
true.
That's right.
I also just wanted to pop in to thank you both for joining us tonight here at Unabridged to do this conversation, and to thank everybody that joined to listen tonight. And then also to echo what they just said, we have both of these books available in the shop now. And of course, purchasing them with us keeps money in our community. It keeps support for independent bookstores, and it supports authors like these to keep doing this kind of research, this kind of work. So please, if you haven't already purchased a copy, use that link in the bio or in the email that you got. Support these two books, these two authors. And if you have any other questions for us or Unabridged, feel free to respond with those. But I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and hope you all will enjoy the Healing Otherness Handbook and Coming Out of the Mississippi Closet.
Magnolia Closet.
Magnolia Closet, you're right.
That's
I'm
the
sorry.
same thing, Magnolia, Mississippi. That's the same. Yeah.
I just
Yeah, I know.
equated the
That's
two.
right.
Anyway, thank you all for joining us, and everybody
Thanks,
have a good
everyone.
night.
Thanks so
Good
much,
night.
Matt. Bye.
Thank you, Matt.